I'm going to be talking a bit about what front-end development's like, what back-end development's like, what it's like actually being full stack and trying both of those, like as a day-to-day, and then my opinions on what people should be doing. Cool. So a little bit about me. I'm a software engineer. I work at Accurix, which is a startup in London. We're still quite a small startup, and we mainly focus on communications in healthcare. So SMS messaging, patient to doctor communication, doctor to doctor communication. And so I've spent part of the time at my current role as a full stack engineer, and then part of the time as just a front end only engineer. So I've tried both in my time at the company. I also do a lot of mentoring through various groups, through work. So some work programs around, getting matched up with mentees, people looking to get into the industry and things. Some informal mentoring, just people who contact me through groups like this, just to get a bit of careers advice. And then also teaching. So just recently I finished teaching the Code First Nano degree, which is a 12-week evening program for women wanting to learn programming. So I do a lot of this sort of stuff as well, outreach and these sorts of things. I'm also a student. I'm studying for a master's in AI and ethics at the University of Cambridge. So I already wear a lot of hats just generally in my life, along with working at a startup, which is always wearing a lot of hats. Cool, so just a bit of background around my journey through the stack. So for a few years while I was at university, a little bit before, I was working at a bunch of different tech startups here in London. So part of that was doing technical work, part of that was doing non-technical work. So there was some technical work on top of existing systems and things, and then some more like managerial things, more community-based things. But I spent a lot of time at quite small companies, so kind of 5 to 10 person startups. For 2019 to 2020, I was working at Delivery, who are based here in London, mainly doing front-end things. That was where my focus was, but I started dabbling a little bit on the back end that was there at the company, which I think is sometimes a natural thing that happens in your front end, to want to like build your own back end as you're going along. So I started doing a bit of back end while I was there. And then I studied for a degree in computer science, so I'd had a bit of background doing like Java and C and these sorts of things. So it wasn't too bad to pick up once I was kind of moving there. Then from last year up until now, when I joined Accurix, I joined as a full stack engineer. So the stack here is kind of React and TypeScript on the front end, and then C#.NET on the back end. And when I joined, I wanted to try doing both of these things just to see what it's like, see what I'm interested in. And so for most of the time at Accurix, I've been full stack. And then recently, in the last few months, I've moved to doing front end only, just so that I can dig in a little bit further. Cool. Oh, there's all sorts of stuff popping up on my screen. I wonder if everybody can see it. So to talk a little bit about pros and cons of front end. One of the reasons that I like front-end development the most is that it's very visual sort of development. So you spend a lot more time really seeing the things that you're making, which is very nice. You write the code, you immediately see it on the screen. In a way, it can also make it a little bit easier to debug things. You can see where things are going wrong almost. You know that if you're trying to make something look a certain way and it doesn't, then that's what the problem is. And it's also very nice to be able to show people what you've made in a very visual way. It's something that you sometimes don't get with backend code, to show people, look at this nice console log printout that I've done. Whereas with front end work, there's a lot more sort of being able to show people very visual things. So that's very nice. You also often, depending on the company, get a chance to get a lot closer to users. So when you're doing front-end work, which is much more kind of focused on the UI and things that people can see and people can interact with, there's a lot more chance to kind of talk to users, see how they're using your products, get a bit more involved in the user experience side of how they're actually interacting with the product. And that can be very interesting. For me personally, I do a lot of work around accessibility, which is, how do blind users interact with web pages? How do keyboard-only users interact with web pages? And really kind of working to get differently abled people using websites and using things that they need to be able to. And so that's something that's a lot more front-end focused, because it's really focusing on users and who's actually using the things that you make, as opposed to making a product and sending it out to the void and never actually knowing who's using it. Depending on the company, the development can also be a bit quicker with front end. Not always, it does depend on the setup, but it can sometimes be easier to kind of get going, especially if you're like learning in your own time and things. It's almost easier to get a bit set up with front end. There's not so much to set up and get running and things, which can be quite nice. It makes it a bit more accessible to people who are starting off looking at engineering. These are the good bits of front end. There's definitely some bits that are quite unique problems to front end, browser compatibility being one of them. When you're writing backend code, it's quite predictable how it's going to run. You've written it, you know exactly what machine it's running on, you know what's going to happen. With front end, there's a lot more unpredictability sometimes around, how is it going to look at different browsers? How is it going to look on different machines, different mobile screens? And these are all things that like you have to have in the back of your mind while you're doing it. And writing the code and checking to make sure that just because it looks good on one screen doesn't mean that it looks good on different screens or different browsers. So that can be quite a unique problem to front end, just because that's the side where people are actually using lots of different things. Code inflation is also a big problem, meaning when you go off to write the code, you think, I don't need to write this, I'll just use a library to do this small thing that I'm trying to do because somebody else has already written a library ready to do something. But when you do that hundreds of times, you end up having very like large package sizes of just using lots and lots of libraries to all do very small bits in your code. And there's lots of different systems that companies use to handle that, but it can often cause a lot of like what's called like code bloating, where that you're actually pulling in a lot of libraries to really do not actually a huge amount. So that's a bit more unique, I think, to front end than with back end code, where you would usually just write the things that you need to write yourself. Cool. So that's a little bit about front end. Some pros and cons of backend also. I think backend definitely appeals a little bit more to people who want to do quite algorithmic thinking, either because you're from a computer science background or like as you've been learning programming, that's the bit that's appealed to you the most. Definitely lets you do a lot more thinking around efficiency and performance and these sorts of things. It's definitely a bit more established just as a discipline. It's a bit older. There's a lot more design patterns of, if you're making a system to do X thing, here's 3 different patterns that we know work well. And there's a lot more kind of best practices and things. Whereas on front end, it can sometimes be a bit more of a free-for-all on everybody thinking that they've got the one solution to doing things properly, but there's not that much in terms of there being established ways to do things. So it can sometimes be a bit harder with front-end code to figure out the best way to do something. Whereas with back-end, it can be a bit easier to follow design patterns and things. And somebody else has already figured out like the best way to do these things, and we know that it's worked at other places. I think backend definitely appeals to people who wanted to get like a bit closer to system architecture, how the systems are built in terms of like different services, in terms of looking at data models and how things are flowing around. So it's definitely, it gets a lot deeper into that, whereas front end can be a lot more surface level, kind of on top of all of these things. With the systems and things also come problems such as security, whereas with front-end code, you might not need to think so much about the security of data. With backend, data breaches and things are obviously a lot more serious. You have to think a lot more about how you're storing things, how you're keeping things secure, the consequences of like things going wrong in the system and how you can kind of mitigate that. So it can definitely be a little bit riskier working on backend things, especially depending on what industry you work in. And also backend presents a new challenge in terms of scaling. So it's almost quite simple to build systems for 5 users, but building systems that hundreds of thousands of people will use simultaneously at the same time is quite a unique challenge in terms of really being able to think about it, reason about it, understand that, and then implement that in the code to really drive that efficiency. And so that can, especially the first time you encounter it, can be quite a lot to understand until you start seeing how systems operate at scale. So that's a bit about front end and back end. a little bit about being full stack. So I was full stack for just under a year at my current company. I've done a little bit in other places. It's definitely quite a common role as well for companies wanting people to be able to work across the stack in terms of being able to do front end and back end. So the good bits are that there's definitely a lot of shared concepts. In the end, they are both software engineering, so they share a lot of ideas around, writing clean code, being able to work collaboratively, how you test things, all these sorts of things are quite shared concepts. So you can bring ideas from one to the other as well. And that can often be very useful and something that you might miss out if you're only doing one or the other. You definitely get to understand a lot more of the infrastructure as you're working, just because you've ended up touching a lot more of it, as opposed to black boxing part of the system and never really thinking about how it works. So that can be really good because it can help you when you're working on either ends of the stack to kind of know how the other side is working. You also do get to try a lot of different things just from the nature of your work. Being full stack means that you touch the front end, you touch the back end, you touch the databases and data modeling and these sorts of things. So it can be very interesting if you do want to get stuck into a lot of different things in your day-to-day. So that's the good bits. There's definitely a lot of context switching when you're working full stack. If in a single day you're working on both like front end and back end, it can be a lot of things to have in your head at one time, of being able to think about both of these, especially if they're quite differently structured and things when it comes to the code. When you're full stack, it's also a bit harder to get very deep into either of these things, just because you don't so much have the time to be going very, very deep into like a singular topic. So you are a little bit more jack of all trades, master of none, as opposed to what's commonly referred to as being T-shaped. So being able to do lots of things, but being able to do one of them really, really well. So being full stack means that you often don't get the chance to do that until you're really working solely as a front end or a back end engineer. And then with that in mind, the remit can be very wide. And so it can be almost hard to understand sometimes, like where the role starts and ends. And so you might end up getting involved in a huge amount of things, more so than like you could ever really feasibly understand as one person. So you get a very surface level understanding of just lots and lots of things because the remit is so wide. Cool. So off the back of all that, what is my advice? For taking with a pinch of salt, of course. I would say if you're very early on in your career, it's great to try lots of different things. You almost don't want to box yourself into one before trying the other. So you might decide that you want to try being a full stack engineer early on in your career, and then see like what parts of the role you like, what parts of the role you don't like, whether you want to continue being full stack, and then switch a bit later. So a lot of people start off full stack, then will specialize because, after a year or two, you have a much better idea of what sort of things you enjoy and what parts of the role you don't enjoy. So you want to do a bit less of. Other piece of advice, that there's also no limit on switching between these things. So just because you've decided to specialize in one doesn't at all mean that you can't move around. So you can be full stack early on or specialize early on, move into full stack, out of full stack, be front end only, be back end only. There really is no limit. And a lot of these engineering principles are really the same between the two things. So there's not that many issues moving between one or the other. And so there's going to be no point in your career as a software engineer where just because you've decided to be backend, for example, it doesn't mean you can never go and do any front-end work or be full stack. Cool. So that's it from me. Where can you find me? On Twitter and Instagram, both with Aleena Code. So do follow me, especially on the Instagram, for a bit more software engineering day in the life content. Cool. That is it from me. I wasn't timing this at all, so I hope this was roughly the right time.